Hey, before we begin, just take a second to settle in. Maybe you're lying in bed. Maybe you're on a couch with one dim lamp still on. Maybe it's late where you are, or strangely early. If you feel like it, you can tap the like button, only if you want to. And if you're still awake enough, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always imagine little lights glowing across the world when you do that. No pressure, just company. Now, let's step into a house. Not a temple, not a battlefield, just a house in ancient Greece. Stone walls, a courtyard open to the sky, olive oil stored in clay jars, dust that never quite leaves. A man lives here, not a king, not a philosopher, just a citizen with land, obligations, dinners to host, political meetings to attend, and an ego that needs polishing more often than his sandals. He needs help. That's all this begins with. He needs help. At first, it's practical. There are errands. There are messages. There are cloaks to carry. There are guests who must be greeted and impressed. So he acquires an attendant. That's the word that sounds clean. An attendant. Someone who walks a step behind him in the marketplace. Someone who knows how to pour wine without spilling. Someone who understands silence. It is, at the beginning, nothing emotional, just logistics. Ancient life runs on logistics. And in a society where public image is everything, the appearance of ease requires invisible labor. So an extra pair of hands becomes useful, very useful. Now here's the quiet thing about usefulness. Usefulness becomes familiarity, and familiarity becomes dependency. The man starts to expect that when he turns, someone will be there. When he gestures, someone will understand. When he speaks too loudly at a symposium and regrets it in the morning, someone will remember what happened. Memory itself becomes a service. That is when the arrangement shifts. Not dramatically, not officially, just gradually. The attendant moves closer to the private rooms of the house. He no longer sleeps in the outer quarters. He is trusted with keys. He knows which political rival to avoid mentioning. He knows which story from youth still embarrasses his master. And in a world where wives remain largely within the women's quarters, where marriages are alliances and not conversations, this closeness fills a gap, not because it was designed to, but because gaps invite occupation. At first, this arrangement feels temporary, just until the household stabilizes, just until marriage deepens, just until children grow older, just until politics calm down. Temporary. Ancient societies loved temporary solutions. Temporary solutions feel safe. You don't have to justify them. You don't have to define them. You just say, for now. And for now stretches. Months pass. Years pass. The attendant grows older. His role grows less defined. He is not family. He is not quite a servant anymore. He is not officially anything. And that ambiguity becomes strangely permanent. No law invented it. No priest blessed it. It simply stayed, like dust in the courtyard. You meant to sweep it tomorrow. Tomorrow never really arrives. And slowly, quietly, the household reorganizes itself around this extra presence. The dinners change. The seating shifts. Guests begin to recognize him. Some raise an eyebrow. Some pretend not to notice. Some whisper. Whispers are another kind of permanence. They last longer than contracts. And so what began as a practical decision, a solution to errands and public image, evolves into something socially delicate, something that must be managed, something that must not be spoken of too clearly, because clarity makes things fragile. Ambiguity lets them survive. And ancient Greece was very good at building structures out of ambiguity, especially when those structures made powerful men more comfortable. Now, the funny thing is, the city also pretended to care very deeply about morality. Athens, especially, loved laws, loved speeches, loved standing in the assembly and talking about virtue as if virtue were measurable. And this is where it gets inconvenient, because while a household could quietly adapt to a permanent male companion, the city did not like certain words attached to that companion. If someone whispered that the relationship was transactional, if someone claimed money changed hands, if someone suggested that the arrangement looked less like loyalty and more like commerce, then the whole thing became dangerous. Not emotionally, politically, because a man who had sold himself, as they phrased it, could lose the right to speak in public. Imagine that. Your private arrangement, tolerated for years, suddenly becoming a weapon in a courtroom. Ancient Greece did not invent hypocrisy, but it refined it beautifully. In the privacy of the courtyard, dependency grows. In the brightness of the assembly, purity is demanded. So men learned to perform distance, to laugh a little too loudly when teased, to insist it was nothing, temporary, just convenience, just mentorship, just companionship. Words are very flexible when status is at stake, and this flexibility is how temporary solutions survive long enough to become tradition. No one announces it, no one celebrates it, but the pattern repeats. Another household, another attendant, another for now. And gradually, what was improvisation becomes expectation. You are important, then you will have someone beside you. You host symposia, then someone young and well-groomed will pour the wine. You travel, someone will carry your cloak. It becomes so ordinary that no one remembers when it began. And that's when something becomes permanent, not when it is declared, when it is forgotten, when its origin dissolves. And that is how a simple need help with errands, help with presents, quietly reshaped intimacy in ancient Greek life. Not loudly, not romantically, not even intentionally, just gradually. And the city kept pretending it was all very temporary. Evening in Athens did not arrive gently. It arrived with noise. Doors closing, sandals slapping against stone, laughter echoing through narrow streets. A servant rushing ahead to make sure the lamps were lit before the master entered. The symposium was not invented for intimacy. It was invented for wine, for politics disguised as philosophy, for rivalry disguised as poetry, for men who had spent the day performing virtue to finally remove their sandals and complain. At least, that was the theory. Temporary release. That was the idea. You spend the day in the assembly arguing about justice. You spend the night reclining on cushions, arguing about love. Balanced, healthy, civilized. Except wine does not stay in its lane. And neither does attention. A symposium needed structure. Someone had to pour. Someone had to refill the craters. Someone had to bring the oil lamps closer when conversation grew quiet. So young attendants became part of the furniture, not because anyone designed it that way, but because someone had to hold the cup steady when a respected citizen leaned too far back. And if the attendant happened to be graceful, if he happened to have clear skin and careful hair, and the kind of posture that made other men notice without meaning to, well, the room adjusted. You see, wine does something interesting. It lowers the volume of caution. and raises the volume of desire. At first, it was harmless. A joke, a playful compliment, a hand resting a little too long on a shoulder. Temporary foolishness. Everyone could laugh the next morning. It was the wine. Wine is the oldest scapegoat. But here is how the improvisation works. One evening becomes two. Two becomes habit. Habit becomes expectation. You host a symposium, then you will have attendants. Not just any attendants, pleasant ones. And now we are no longer solving a practical problem. We are maintaining an atmosphere. The atmosphere itself becomes the purpose. If a host does not provide elegance, he seems cheap. If he provides too much elegance, he seems indulgent. So he learns to balance on a social tightrope. And the attendants learn to read the room. Who is drunk enough to ignore? Who is powerful enough to appease? Who is dangerous enough to avoid eye contact with? Ancient Greece loved calling itself rational, but the symposium was a laboratory of irrational behavior, and laboratories produce habits. Soon, certain boys are requested, invited again, recognized. Their presence signals status. Oh, he brought that one again. The phrase carries weight, not accusation, recognition, and recognition is sticky. You see how the loop forms? The attendant from the household now appears at the symposium. He pours wine. He stands close enough to hear political secrets. He laughs at jokes that are not funny. He learns which guest becomes sentimental and which becomes violent. Temporary participation, just until the evening ends. Except evenings never quite end cleanly. Someone stays after. Someone whispers. Someone offers gifts. Gifts are interesting. They are not wages. They are tokens. A cloak. A small coin purse. A promise of protection. And this is where Athens becomes anxious. Because once gifts accumulate, the city begins to ask questions. Was this affection, or was it payment? The difference matters. Not morally, legally. If a citizen youth is seen as accepting money for his body, he risks losing his civic voice later in life. Imagine that irony. The same city that encouraged symposia as social glue would later stand in court and dissect what happened on those cushions. The same men who laughed and drank would become jurors, and jurors have long memories when it suits them. So the arrangement adapts again. Everything must look voluntary. Everything must look dignified, even when it is neither. This is how systems become self-protecting. No one says, "Let us create male concubines." No one drafts a law. Instead, small adjustments occur. An attendant sleeps closer to the inner courtyard. A patron pays school fees out of generosity. A youth spends more time at one house than his own. Temporary solutions. A place to stay for the winter. Extra tutoring. Better clothes. Comfort expands. Dependence deepens. And the city looks away until someone runs for office. Then suddenly, everything is remembered. Did you not, when you were young, dine too often at that man's house? Athens did not forget. It simply waited, which creates a strange kind of pressure. A young man must balance desire, ambition, and reputation like fragile pottery. One careless rumor, and his future collapses. So what does he do? He becomes subtle. He learns to accept gifts that do not look like payment. He avoids certain districts. He avoids appearing too eager. He performs reluctance. Reluctance becomes part of the script, and scripts repeated often enough feel ancient, sacred even, but they were never sacred. They were improvised to solve loneliness. Improvised to manage public image. Improvised to satisfy desire without destroying status. And improvisations, when repeated in dim light long enough, begin to feel natural, which is dangerous, because natural things are harder to question. And so the symposium, meant to be temporary release, becomes an institution that quietly stabilizes male intimacy, not romanticized, not celebrated openly, just normalized. And normalization is more powerful than law. You can outlaw behavior. You cannot easily uproot habit, especially habit wrapped in wine and laughter. The lamps burn low, guests leave, the house grows quiet, and the attendant remains, always remaining. That is the part no one writes into the speeches. The remaining. In Athens, nothing truly disappeared. Not a debt. Not a promise. Not a rumor. Rumors in particular had a way of aging like wine. They darkened. They thickened. They became useful. Let's imagine something small. A young man, years ago, attended too many symposia. He lingered too long in one particular house. He accepted gifts carefully, politely, always framed as generosity. At the time, no one objected. The wine flowed. The lamps burned. It was all temporary. Just youth. Just charm. Just the harmless indulgence of older men who missed their own beauty. And then time passed. The young man aged. He shaved. His voice deepened. He inherited property. He stood in the assembly one morning and spoke. Spoke loudly. Spoke against someone powerful. And that is when the temporary past returned. Athens loved democracy, but it loved humiliation more. Someone would rise, clear his throat, and say gently, casually, "Are we truly to be advised by a man who once—" The sentence never needed finishing. Everyone knew the rest. This is where the system reveals itself. It was never about desire. It was about control. The city had created a quiet contradiction. As long as you were young and beautiful and silent, your closeness to powerful men was charming. But if you later sought power yourself, the same closeness became contamination, temporary indulgence, permanent stain. And so the courtroom became a stage. Speeches were delivered about morality, about purity, about civic virtue. But beneath it all was something simpler: envy, fear, and the pleasure of dragging someone back into their own adolescence. Ancient Athens had a particular anxiety about men who were for hire. It wasn't framed as sexual disgust exactly. It was framed as political danger. If he once sold himself, the argument went, what will he sell next? Notice the shift. An act in private becomes proof of corruption in public. It's an elegant transformation, cruel, but elegant. And so young men learned something. They learned that affection could be tolerated. Mentorship could be praised. But money changed everything. A gift must never look like a price. A favor must never look like a transaction. The difference is subtle. Subtle enough that it could be denied. Subtle enough that it could be weaponized, which meant that every relationship lived under a kind of future threat. Even if no one intended harm, even if the arrangement felt mutual, even if both parties believed it was just companionship, the city was always watching, or at least pretending to, and pretending is often enough. Now imagine the awkwardness. A former attendant, now a citizen of standing, entering the assembly. Across the room sits a man who once reclined beside him at a symposium. They both remember. They both pretend not to. Politics in ancient Greece required selective amnesia. But selective amnesia is fragile. One insult, one rivalry, one failed alliance, and suddenly the past becomes evidence. The whisper becomes a document, not written, but repeated, repeated until jurors nod. It's almost absurd. The same men who once praised youth now condemning it. The same city that structured its social life around male company pretending shock at male closeness. Dry humour hides in this, because Athens prided itself on rational debate, yet so much hinged on rumour, on insinuation, on carefully chosen words like sold, corrupted, shameless. Language did the violence. No chains required. And here's the quiet irony. The laws that punished prostitution were often framed as protecting the youth, protecting them from exploitation. But in practice, the youth carried the risk into adulthood. If he was poor, he was vulnerable. If his guardian was careless, he was exposed. If he needed stability, he accepted help. And later, that help could become accusation, temporary necessity, permanent liability. The system was clever. It allowed the powerful to indulge safely, but it ensured that only certain men paid the price later. Not the patrons, almost never the patrons. The young, the ambitious, the ones who tried to rise. This creates a strange atmosphere in the city, a tension beneath daily life. At a symposium, laughter. At a trial, judgment. In the courtyard, intimacy. In the assembly, denial. And so relationships adapt again. More secrecy, more coded language, more careful choreography. A man might maintain a companion, but publicly emphasize his marriage. He might fund a youth's education, but through intermediaries. He might host dinners, but avoid certain gestures. Improvisation layered on improvisation. A temporary fix to a temporary risk, until the fixes themselves become tradition. And tradition in Greece was persuasive. If something had always been done, who would question it? No one remembered the first attendant. No one remembered the first symposium that went too far. They only remembered the speeches. The speeches survive. The quiet arrangements rarely do. And that imbalance between what is lived and what is recorded shapes everything we think we know. The house still stands. The courtyard still collects dust. The attendant still remains. But now he understands something. He understands that permanence in Athens is dangerous. Better to appear temporary, even when you are not. In every respectable Athenian house, there were rooms guests never saw. Rooms that were not meant for reclining, not meant for debate, not meant for poetry. They existed for utility, storage, sleep, waiting. Slavery is rarely described in whispers, but it is lived in whispers. Because the most ordinary cruelty does not need to announce itself. It simply exists. A slave boy in a Greek household did not arrive as a romantic figure. He arrived as inventory, purchased, inherited, captured, transferred like oil jars. At first, his role was practical: water carrying, laundry, fire tending, simple, temporary, perhaps, until stronger labourers were acquired, temporary until he grew older, temporary until someone else replaced him. Except he did not leave, because slaves rarely left. The temporary solution here was ownership itself. You need help. You buy help. You do not rent it. You do not negotiate with it. You acquire it. And when a body becomes property, permanence is built in. No debate required. Now, here is the uncomfortable, quiet detail. In a society where adult women were often secluded within domestic spaces, and where male citizens socialized primarily with other men, the enslaved male body became an accessible presence, not hidden, not protected by civic status, not shielded by reputation, and access, when constant, shifts behavior. At first, perhaps it was incidental, a hand where it did not need to be, a command given too softly, a night when wine lingered longer than restraint. Temporary lapse. Blame the wine again. Wine has been blamed for centuries, but the slave does not carry civic consequences. He does not speak in the assembly later. He does not accuse in court. He does not inherit. So the risk is low, and low risk encourages repetition. Repetition creates normalization. Normalization erases shock. This is how something unspoken becomes structurally permanent. No law was passed to create male concubines among slaves. No philosopher defended it. It simply did not require justification. Ownership was justification enough. And in this context, concubine is almost too polite a word, because concubinage implies recognition. This was not recognized. It was absorbed. A slave assigned to attend the master might sleep closer to the inner rooms. Not because of ceremony, because it was convenient. Convenience is powerful. It reshapes architecture. It reshapes sleeping arrangements. It reshapes expectations. You wake in the night. You call a name. Someone answers. And slowly, over years, that response becomes routine. Routine feels neutral. Routine hides power. Now here is where it becomes subtly ironic. In Athens, a citizen who had sold himself could lose political rights, but a man who used his slave sexually faced no such public civic stain. The city worried about transactions. It worried about citizens degrading themselves for money. It did not worry nearly as much about the silent degradation of property, which reveals something uncomfortable about priorities. Morality was not about consent. It was about status, about who could speak, about who counted. So, inside these houses, relationships could form that looked stable. A master might favor one slave over others, provide better clothing, better food, protection from harsher labor, even education, not out of rebellion, but preference. Preference becomes attachment. Attachment becomes possessiveness. Possessiveness becomes something close to intimacy. And intimacy built on ownership is deeply confusing. For the slave, it might mean relative safety. For the master, it might feel like affection. For outsiders, it was invisible. Because slaves were invisible, they moved quietly. They did not vote. They did not testify against citizens in most cases. And so, a system designed as economic convenience quietly stabilized emotional dependency. Temporary solution: I need labor. Permanent result: I am accustomed to this person beside me. And here is the subtle humor, if one can call it that. Ancient Greek philosophers loved discussing self-control, moderation, virtue. They debated the nature of desire in symposia that slaves facilitated, while those same slaves absorbed the consequences of unmoderated behavior. The architecture of the house made this possible. Outer courtyard for guests, inner rooms for family, service corridors for slaves. Desire traveled through those corridors at night, unrecorded, unlegislated, and because no public speech captured it, it felt almost unreal. But unreal things can last centuries. This is the part historians struggle to document. Because the evidence whispers, a joke in comedy, a moralizing remark, a hint in a speech, a vase image showing a youth being pursued. None of it says directly, this was common, but none of it denies it either. It lingers, like smoke in a room long after the lamp is extinguished. And when something lingers without confrontation, it embeds itself in culture. Young slave boys were trained not just in tasks, but in posture, in silence, in attentiveness. Skills that make a person useful. Skills that also make a person desirable. The training had economic logic, but it had emotional consequences. And because slavery was permanent and less disrupted, the relationships it generated could last decades. Decades of shared routines, shared secrets, shared aging, which complicates the word temporary. Nothing in this system was meant to be romantic. It was meant to be efficient. Efficiency often births unintended permanence. A solution to labor becomes a solution to loneliness. A solution to image becomes a solution to desire. No one writes a manifesto. No one creates a ceremony. The arrangement simply continues. And the city continues pretending that morality resides only in transactions between citizens. Inside the quiet rooms without doors, permanence grows quietly. Power changes everything. In a small Athenian house, intimacy had to be quiet. In a court, especially a royal one, intimacy could become spectacle. Let's move forward in time. Alexander, not yet the legend, just a young king with too much ambition and not enough rest. Courts are strange ecosystems. They are built on proximity. Who stands closest to the ruler? Who whispers into his ear? Who pours his wine? Who enters without knocking? These are not small privileges. They are political positions. At first, proximity to power is practical. A king needs attendants, messengers, armor-bearers, personal servants who know how to move silently through tents and marble halls alike. Temporary arrangements, just until the campaign ends, just until the territory stabilizes, just until the next battle. But campaigns stretch, empires expand, temporary camps become permanent capitals, and the men closest to the ruler remain close. Now imagine this. In the middle of a court, gathering soldiers, generals, nobles watching, a favored companion receives a public gesture, a kiss, a hand held too long, laughter ripples. Some cheer, some look away, but everyone notices. In a city like Athens, such a gesture would be denied. In a royal court, it becomes theatre, and theatre does something important. It normalizes what it repeats. If the king embraces a male companion openly, then intimacy becomes a signal, not weakness, favor, and favor in a monarchy is currency, which changes the entire logic. In Athens, male intimacy had to avoid looking transactional. In a court, intimacy itself becomes transaction. Be close to the king, and you gain influence. Land, protection, access, temporary favoritism. That is how it begins. But favoritism has a way of sticking. A court favorite learns routines, learns moods, learns which generals are resentful, learns when the king grows lonely. Loneliness at the top is acute. You cannot trust everyone. You cannot relax around everyone. But you can relax around someone. And that someone, initially just an attendant, becomes indispensable. Indispensability breeds permanence. The court begins to adjust. Officials must go through him. Petitions pass through him. Rumors swirl around him. Now the relationship is no longer private. It is structural, and this is where irony deepens. In democratic Athens, a man could be politically destroyed for selling his body. In a monarchy, closeness to the ruler could elevate you above generals. The same intimacy that meant shame in one system could mean power in another. Context changes morality. Power rewrites discomfort. Now, think of the soldiers watching. Men raised in Greek traditions of male companionship in gymnasiums and symposia. But here they see it scaled up, amplified, not whispered, displayed. It must have felt both familiar and unsettling, because spectacle exaggerates what was once subtle. A court favorite does not need to hide gifts. He receives them publicly. He may even receive territory. The relationship becomes embedded in governance. And once governance relies on personal intimacy, it is very difficult to separate the two. Temporary affection, permanent influence, and courts are excellent at making temporary emotions into institutions. When the king favors someone, others imitate. Imitation spreads behavior downward. What was exceptional becomes fashionable. Fashion hardens into expectation. Expectation becomes tradition. And tradition in royal courts can outlive the original emotion entirely. Later, generations may not even know why a certain position exists. They only know that someone must occupy it, that someone must stand close, that someone must whisper first. And so intimacy, once improvised in houses and symposia, evolves into political architecture. This does not mean it was always romantic. It was often strategic, often protective, often layered with fear. But fear also binds people, especially when power is unstable. Now imagine the fragility. If a king dies suddenly, if a court favorite falls from grace, proximity becomes dangerous. The same closeness that elevated you can condemn you. History remembers favorites with suspicion, as manipulators, as corruptors, as temptations, even when their primary role was simply to be near, which is strangely consistent. From the Athenian household to the Macedonian court, the pattern repeats. Need someone near, allow them near, become accustomed, depend on them, restructure around them. Pretend it is temporary, watch it become permanent, then deny it mattered. Time blurs, generations pass, but the architecture remains. Someone always stands close to power. Someone always benefits from intimacy, and someone always pretends that intimacy is incidental. Let's begin gently. A young boy in Crete grows up hearing something ordinary. One day, someone will come for you, not in secret, not in scandal, openly, publicly. He will be taken. Now the word sounds violent to us, but to them it was structured, almost ceremonial. At least, that is how later writers describe it. The idea, at first, may have been simple. How do you mark the transition from childhood to adulthood? How do you create loyalty among warriors? How do you bind generations together? Temporary solution. Dramatize the shift. Stage an abduction. Make it feel intense. Make it memorable. And then send the pair into the countryside for a period of separation. Training, instruction, shared hardship, temporary exile, temporary intimacy, temporary dependence, and then return. Initiated, recognized, folded back into the community. That might have been the beginning. An improvisation for social cohesion, a theatrical way to mark growth, because societies love drama. Drama sticks. Ritualized drama sticks even harder. But here is what happens when a symbolic act is repeated. The symbolism fades, the structure remains. If every generation repeats the abduction, it stops feeling metaphorical. It becomes expectation. Young boys anticipate it. Families discuss it. Suitors compete for the role. Competition introduces status. Status introduces hierarchy. Hierarchy introduces prestige. Suddenly, who abducts you matters. Suddenly, being chosen carries social weight. The temporary right becomes a ladder, and ladders are rarely dismantled once installed. Now, the countryside period, the time spent together, likely varied widely in reality. Some may have experienced mentorship. Some may have experienced coercion. Some may have experienced confusion. But because it was framed as tradition, questioning it would mean questioning the social fabric itself. And questioning fabric is risky. So even if the arrangement felt uncomfortable for some, the ritual protected it. Temporary separation from the village becomes permanent expectation for every youth. And the cleverness of ritual is that it makes repetition feel sacred. Once sacred, behavior is shielded. You are no longer improvising. You are honoring ancestors. And when behavior is tied to ancestors, it becomes very difficult to untangle. The boy grows, returns. Now he may one day abduct someone himself. The cycle loops. Temporary initiation, permanent cycle. And cycles create continuity. Continuity feels like stability. Even if its origins were improvised, there is dry humor hidden here. Imagine a community explaining this to outsiders. No, no, it is not scandalous. It is tradition. Tradition has a remarkable ability to sanitize complexity. It smooths edges. It turns tension into ceremony. And because everyone participates, it distributes responsibility. No single person invented it. No single person can dismantle it. It is simply how things are done. And once behavior is embedded into how things are done, it is almost invisible, which is powerful. Now notice the pattern again. In the Athenian house, closeness emerged from convenience. In the symposium, from atmosphere. In the court, from proximity to power. In Crete, from ritualized transition. Different settings, same mechanism. Temporary need, repeated solution, social adjustment, permanent expectation. The human brain loves patterns. Once it experiences something repeatedly in youth, it often accepts it as natural in adulthood. So a boy who was abducted ceremonially may later see similar closeness as unremarkable, normal, structured, expected. And that expectation reshapes future relationships quietly. The society doesn't need to argue about male intimacy. It has already woven it into a rite of passage, which means debate becomes unnecessary. Debate is loud. Ritual is quiet. Quiet systems last longer. Now, not all Greek regions followed the same script. Sparta, for example, had its own approach to male bonding. Less theatrical, perhaps, more disciplined, or at least described that way. But again, the pattern repeats. Where young men train together intensely, emotional bonds form. Temporary military training becomes lifelong loyalty. Lifelong loyalty becomes a culture of male closeness. Closeness becomes normalized, and normalized behavior rarely feels radical from the inside. It feels inevitable. So whether through ceremony, war, household labor, or wine-soaked evenings, ancient Greece kept rediscovering the same solution. When men live together intensely, intimacy finds space. And once space exists, repetition builds structure. Structure becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity. Identity becomes defended. Even if its origin was improvisation, the wind on Crete continues. Generations pass. Boys are taken. Boys return. Men remember their own time in the hills. They laugh about it, or they don't, but they repeat it. And repetition is the quiet architect of permanence. Sparta did not advertise tenderness. It advertised strength, silence, endurance. Boys were taken from their homes early, not ceremonially abducted in the Cretan style, at least not theatrically, simply removed. For training, for the state, temporary separation, they might have said, just until adulthood, just until he becomes useful. Temporary, the word follows us everywhere. In Sparta, boys lived together, slept together, trained together, ate barely enough, stole if they had to, endured punishment if caught. Hardship was the teacher, or so the story goes. Now imagine growing up inside that intensity. Days structured by drills, nights structured by shared exhaustion, privacy minimal, emotion restrained. Where does tenderness go in such a place? It does not disappear. It condenses. Condensed emotion becomes powerful. At first, older youths mentoring younger ones seems practical. You need supervision. You need role models. Temporary arrangement, just until the younger boy toughens. But mentorship often grows roots, especially when survival depends on loyalty. An older youth might guide a younger one through hunger, through fear, through punishment. Protection creates gratitude. Gratitude creates attachment. Attachment, repeated across generations, becomes expectation. Some ancient writers insisted Spartan bonds were chaste, purely moral, disciplined. Others implied more complexity. The contradiction itself is revealing. Sparta marketed virtue, outsiders suspected desire, and somewhere between marketing and suspicion lived reality. Now here is the quiet irony. The same society that forced boys into shared hardship would later expect them to marry women. Yet some accounts describe wedding rituals where the bride was disguised, hair cut short, dressed in a way that softened the transition from male company to female companionship, a temporary adjustment to ease change. But the existence of such an adjustment hints at something deeper. Habits formed in youth are difficult to replace. So society improvises again. If men are accustomed to male closeness, then marriage must adapt. Ritual becomes patchwork, temporary patch, permanent custom. You see how it happens. Sparta did not invent male bonding. It intensified it, structured it, wrapped it in discipline so tightly that desire, if present, could hide behind obedience. And obedience is rarely questioned. If a bond forms under the banner of training, it can be defended as patriotic. If affection grows under the shadow of duty, it can be reframed as loyalty. Language protects behavior. Just as in Athens, language protected reputation. Just as in Crete, ritual protected repetition. The mechanisms differ. The result rhymes. Young men accustomed to shared lives, shared bodies in close quarters, shared risks, shared silence. And once shared silence exists, words are not always necessary. Now imagine the transition. A Spartan man, hardened, disciplined, entering marriage, expected to produce children, expected to maintain the state, yet emotionally calibrated through years of male proximity. It creates tension, not dramatic, subtle, a recalibration that never fully erases the past. Temporary training, permanent imprint. Sparta's system was meant to create warriors, efficient, unbreakable. But human systems rarely remain limited to their intended purpose. They spill over, they reshape emotional landscapes. And when something becomes foundational to identity, we are Spartans, we train this way. Questioning its emotional consequences becomes nearly impossible, because to question the bond is to question the state. And states do not enjoy introspection, so the bonds remain, discussed obliquely, defended rhetorically, lived quietly. Now notice how the pattern keeps circling. Household convenience, symposium atmosphere, court proximity, Cretan ritual, Spartan discipline, different words, same undercurrent, temporary necessity, repetition, normalization, defense. And because it repeats across regions and centuries, it stops feeling accidental. It feels Greek, which is perhaps the strangest transformation of all. An improvisation repeated enough times begins to feel like identity. Identity is the most permanent structure humans build, even when its foundations were laid in convenience. The wind in Sparta is colder than Crete, but the echo is the same. Men raised together, lives entangled, arrangements justified, pretending always that everything was simply practical. And practical things are easier to defend. Athens loved comedy, not gentle humor, sharp comedy, cruel sometimes, public, performed in daylight before thousands. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was too sacred to mock. Politicians were mocked, philosophers were mocked, generals were mocked, and yes, relationships were mocked. Now think about that. If something appears repeatedly in comedy, it means it is recognizable. A joke only works if the audience already understands the reference. So when a playwright hints at an older man obsessing over a beautiful youth, the audience laughs because they have seen it. When a character is accused on stage of being too fond of certain houses, the audience laughs because they know the houses. When a youth is teased for accepting too many gifts, the laughter is immediate. Comedy does not invent behavior. It exaggerates it, and exaggeration makes patterns visible. At first, these jokes might have been temporary entertainment, just seasonal festivals, just dramatic flair. But repetition matters. Once something becomes a running joke, it becomes part of cultural vocabulary. People begin to reference it casually in daily speech. Careful, you'll end up in a comedy, which means the behavior must now manage not only law and politics, but ridicule. Ridicule is powerful, sometimes more powerful than law, because law threatens punishment. Ridicule threatens dignity, and dignity in Athens was oxygen. Now here is the interesting part. Comedy mocked both sides. The older lover portrayed as ridiculous, the younger companion portrayed as calculating, the whole arrangement painted as slightly absurd, which creates tension. If everyone laughs at it, why does it continue? Because laughter does not dismantle systems. It often stabilizes them. By turning behavior into humor, society releases pressure. See, we can laugh about it, which means we do not have to confront it. Temporary laughter, permanent normalization. The joke becomes shield, and shields protect what they pretend to expose. Now imagine sitting in that audience, a man whose youth was shaped by such relationships, a man currently maintaining one quietly, hearing exaggerated versions of his life shouted across a theatre. He laughs. He must laugh. If he does not laugh, suspicion grows. So he participates in the performance of distance. This is how culture layers itself. Private intimacy, public denial, comic exaggeration, political accusation, all orbiting the same human behavior. And over time, the joke hardens. Certain gestures become coded. Certain words carry double meaning, even without naming anything directly. You could insult someone by implication, just a tone, just a raised eyebrow. Language evolves around what cannot be said plainly. And because it evolves slowly, it feels organic, but it was shaped by repetition. Now here is the subtle absurdity. Athens prided itself on being the cradle of rational thought. Philosophers debated the nature of love, virtue, and self-control in elevated language. Meanwhile, the comic stage depicted the same themes as slapstick, high theory and low humor describing the same social habits. Two mirrors reflecting the same arrangement from opposite angles, neither fully dismantling it, just circling it. This creates an interesting effect. When a system is both philosophized and mocked, it becomes deeply embedded. It is too ordinary to be shocking, too complicated to be eliminated. So it lingers, like a line from a play that refuses to leave your mind. And because it lingers, young boys grow up hearing the jokes, hearing the insinuations, watching the stage, understanding before anyone explains directly how things work. They learn what to avoid, what to accept, what to perform, what to deny. Culture teaches through laughter more efficiently than through law. A joke repeated annually becomes education, temporary entertainment, permanent social training, and so the pattern loops again. A practical arrangement becomes a household habit. A habit becomes a symposium norm. A norm becomes legal risk. Legal risk becomes comic material. Comic material becomes cultural shorthand. Cultural shorthand becomes expectation. Expectation becomes identity. And identity resists change, even when mocked, perhaps especially when mocked, because mockery suggests familiarity, and familiarity is comfort. Now, imagine the quiet irony. A youth being teased in a comedy might later stand in court accused of the same behavior. The audience who once laughed now sits as jurors. Humor softens memory, but it does not erase it. Athens was a city of overlapping stages. Theatre stage, courtroom stage, symposium stage, household stage, different scripts, same actors, different lighting, same patterns. And the joke keeps repeating, because repetition is how culture breathes. The courtyard is quieter now. The stone is the same, but the sound has changed. No more hurried sandals. No more anxious preparation before political meetings. No more youthful energy moving too quickly through narrow halls. The man is older, not dramatically, just enough. His hair thinner, his voice slower, his steps more deliberate. Time does something subtle to power. It softens its edges. The man who once stood confidently in the assembly now attends less often. The symposium invitations grow fewer. Younger men dominate the conversations. New rivalries replace old ones. And suddenly, the house becomes central again. The house always waits patiently for men to age. Now here is where the word temporary begins to dissolve completely. The attendant, once a boy, is no longer young. He has aged within the same walls. His posture changed too. His movements slower. His familiarity deeper. They no longer perform distance. There is no need. Youth required performance. Age requires honesty, or at least less energy to pretend. What began as convenience has become continuity. Not dramatic love, not scandalous romance. Continuity, a shared memory of decades, shared mornings, shared evenings, shared political anxieties that no longer matter. Now, imagine the silence at night. No assembly tomorrow, no war campaign, no theatrical performance to attend, just the quiet echo of years lived. And in that quiet, proximity matters more than ever. Temporary companionship in youth becomes permanent presence in old age. And permanence feels different when mortality approaches. The irony is gentle. Athens once threatened civic death for youthful impropriety, but biological death levels everything. No jury deliberates at the end. No playwright mocks. No rival interrupts. Only the house remains. And the person who remained inside it. This is the part history rarely records, because it is not dramatic. It does not produce speeches. It does not generate scandal. It simply persists. The boy who once navigated gifts carefully, who balanced on the line between affection and accusation, who learned to accept without appearing available, now sits beside the man who once worried about reputation. Neither concerned any more with appearances. Reputation fades faster than routine. Routine becomes intimacy. Intimacy becomes habit. Habit becomes comfort. And comfort in old age is precious. What was once socially risky now feels ordinary, because risk belongs to ambition, and ambition fades. Now here is something quietly absurd. The system that began to solve loneliness in youth solves loneliness again in age. It loops. The same arrangement that provided companionship in political adulthood now provides companionship in decline. Temporary fix. Permanent cycle. If the man dies first, the attendant remains in the house, perhaps inherited by the next generation, perhaps freed, perhaps displaced. History does not always tell us. But imagine the emotional complexity. Decades of shared life categorized legally as property, or mentorship, or nothing at all. Language struggles here because the structure was never clean. It was layered, economic, emotional, practical, strategic, lonely, comforting, exploitative, supportive, contradictory, all at once, and time smooths contradictions. From the outside, it may look like a stable arrangement. From the inside, it was likely negotiated daily. Subtle adjustments, unspoken understandings, the temporary feeling of just for now stretched across a lifetime. Now the courtyard fills with dust again, always the dust. The same dust that settled when the first arrangement began, the same dust that covered sandals after symposia, the same dust that listened to whispered conversations. Dust does not judge. Dust accumulates, which is perhaps the best metaphor for culture. Layer upon layer, temporary footprints fading, patterns remaining. If someone asked, when did this become normal? No one could answer precisely, because it did not happen in a single moment. It happened through repetition, through comfort, through silence, through adjustment, through the refusal to define too clearly what worked. And that refusal may have been the system's greatest strength, because what is undefined cannot easily be dismantled. What is undefined can adapt. It can survive courts. It can survive comedy. It can survive kings. It can survive philosophers. It can survive old age. The house remains. The courtyard remains. Someone stands beside someone else. Always. Sometimes as servant, sometimes as companion, sometimes as favorite, sometimes as memory, and the word temporary finally loses its meaning, because nothing here was ever truly temporary. It only pretended to be. The old man is gone now. Funerals in Greece were structured, controlled, ritualized. Public grief, measured lament, proper garments, everything orderly. Temporary mourning, just until life resumes. Life always resumes. The son inherits the house, the courtyard, the responsibilities. He also inherits familiarity. Because even if no one explained anything to him directly, he grew up watching. Children in ancient Greece learned by observation. They learned posture by watching fathers in the assembly. They learned speech by listening at doorways. They learned silence by noticing what was not discussed. And he noticed the man who was always there, the attendant who aged beside his father, the quiet glances, the shared routines, nothing dramatic, nothing scandalous, just consistent presence. And consistency teaches more powerfully than instruction. At first, the son may distance himself. He is young, ambitious, eager to prove difference. He attends new symposia. He befriends new companions. He assures himself that his household will be structured more cleanly, more rationally, more disciplined. Temporary resolve. Because youth always believes it can redesign what it inherits. But daily life is persuasive. The house still needs managing. Guests still need receiving. Public life still requires performance. And loneliness still hums in the background. The son may hire attendants purely for practicality. He may even insist on formal distance. But proximity reshapes intention. Again, a new youth enters the household, perhaps purchased, perhaps introduced, perhaps attached through patronage, temporary solution, just assistance, just organization, just help navigating the chaos of adulthood. And slowly, almost embarrassingly slowly, the son feels the same comfort his father once felt, the same reliance, the same ease in being understood without explanation. At first he resists it. He tells himself it is different, more professional, less personal, more structured. But structure does not prevent familiarity. Familiarity does not prevent attachment. Attachment does not ask permission. And so history repeats, not dramatically, but gently. The son does not consciously imitate his father. He simply walks the same corridors, sits in the same courtyard, hosts in the same rooms. And architecture influences behavior. The design of Greek houses did not change between generations. Outer courtyard, inner chambers, service spaces, private zones, public zones. Physical proximity makes repetition easy, and when repetition is easy, culture persists. Now imagine the son, years later, overhearing a joke in the theatre, a line that resembles something from his own life. He laughs, just as his father once laughed, because laughter signals belonging, and belonging is safer than isolation. Temporary laughter, permanent alignment. The son may also enter politics, and with politics comes risk. He remembers, perhaps faintly, the speeches that targeted men for their youthful entanglements. So he calibrates, he adjusts, he performs discretion, he chooses words carefully, he avoids overt display. But private life does not always obey public strategy, and so he lives within the same tension, the same delicate line between affection and accusation, between gift and transaction, between mentorship and dependency. It becomes almost routine, and routine dulls anxiety. What felt scandalous to outsiders becomes ordinary inside the walls. Now here is the strange continuity. The system never needed explicit teaching. It survived because it was woven into daily patterns, into architecture, into male social spaces, into rites of passage, into economic structures, into humor, into silence. Remove one piece and another compensates. A ritual fades in one region. A court spectacle rises in another. A legal crackdown in Athens. A different framing in Sparta. But the gravitational pull remains. Temporary fixes solving similar human problems across generations, across cities, across regimes. The son ages. He becomes the father. And somewhere in the courtyard, another boy learns by watching, not taught, not instructed, just observing the shape of adult life. And the shape includes proximity. It includes silence. It includes unspoken arrangements that everyone recognizes and no one defines, which may be the most enduring part of all. Not the laws, not the speeches, not the scandals. The unspoken understanding that certain forms of closeness exist, that they are navigated carefully, that they are justified when useful, mocked when convenient, condemned when politically advantageous, but never entirely absent. Temporary solutions, permanent inheritance. The house remains, the dust returns, footsteps echo again in corridors that have heard centuries of similar patterns. And no one can point to the exact moment when it began, which is precisely why it continues. Money in ancient Greece was small, heavy coins, metal that clinked, visible, audible, hard to ignore. And that was the problem, because as long as intimacy could pretend to be affection, it was manageable. But once silver appeared, everything shifted. At first, it was simple generosity. An older man admiring a youth might offer a cloak. Nothing scandalous, just warmth for winter. Or perhaps sponsor his training, pay for a lyre teacher, cover the cost of oil at the gymnasium. It could be framed beautifully. Mentorship, encouragement, investment in talent, temporary assistance. No one would object to helping a promising boy, especially if he came from a modest household. But here is the delicate line. If the gift became regular, if the generosity became expected, if the youth began to depend on it, then it no longer looked like kindness. It looked like arrangement, and arrangement invites scrutiny. Athens had a peculiar anxiety, not about desire itself, but about transaction. A citizen man who sold himself that phrase again risked losing his civic voice. Selling implies agency. It implies choice. It implies degradation. But what if you never thought of it as selling? What if you thought of it as survival, or comfort, or simply the natural exchange of affection? The city did not care about nuance. It cared about categories. You either maintained dignity, or you compromised it. And money made compromise visible. Coins leave trails. Cloaks can be explained. Education can be praised. But silver cannot pretend to be poetry, which is why gift-giving evolved into an art. Subtlety became essential. A patron might give through intermediaries, through a father, through a teacher, through a friend. He might never hand coins directly. He might instead provide opportunities, an introduction, a position, a small plot of land, temporary generosity, permanent dependency. Because once a youth's comfort depends on a patron's favor, his freedom narrows. Not dramatically, quietly, he must maintain favor. He must avoid anger. He must remain agreeable. And this is where irony deepens again. Athens feared that a man who had once been paid for intimacy would later sell political loyalty. Yet the system of patronage itself encouraged quiet loyalty, just not openly transactional loyalty. The difference was aesthetic. And aesthetics matter deeply in societies obsessed with reputation. Now consider the opposite extreme, the brothel, the explicit exchange, the coin placed clearly, the service delivered clearly. There is almost honesty in it. And that honesty is precisely why it was condemned, because clarity makes things hard to romanticize. A brothel does not pretend to be mentorship. It does not pretend to be affection. It does not pretend to be education. It states plainly, this is commerce. And commerce, when applied to the citizen male body, was threatening. Because commerce implies equivalence. It implies that bodies can be priced. And if a citizen can be priced once, what stops him from being priced again? So the city drew a line. Gift acceptable, payment dangerous. Except the line was invisible. And invisible lines create anxiety. Young men learn to live on that line, to accept enough generosity to benefit, but not so much that it looked like wage, to appear grateful but not dependent, to appear desired but not available. A performance of reluctance became fashionable. You must not seem eager. Eagerness looks cheap. Detachment looks dignified, even if you are quietly calculating the next meal. And because so many boys navigated this narrow corridor, it became a shared skill, a cultural competence. You learn how to accept. You learn how to refuse politely. You learn how to signal interest without signaling need. Temporary navigation of youth, permanent impact on adulthood. Now imagine growing up inside that tension. You measure every gift. You measure every visit. You wonder how much is too much. You watch older men fall from grace because someone framed their past differently. You hear courtroom speeches dissecting youth like a crime scene. And you adjust. Adjustment becomes instinct. Instinct becomes tradition. And tradition becomes so subtle that later generations assume it always existed. This is the quiet genius of systems built on ambiguity. They require constant calibration, and that constant calibration keeps them alive. If the rules were clear, they could be dismantled. But when the rules are aesthetic about appearances, impressions, tone, they shift like light on stone, hard to grasp, harder to challenge, and so money circulates quietly. Cloaks are gifted, lessons are funded, horses are provided, rooms are offered, temporary generosity, long-term attachment. The coin rarely changes hands directly, but value always moves. And value, once exchanged repeatedly, reshapes relationships permanently. You see how small the beginning was. Just help with expenses. Just support for talent. Just kindness. Nothing scandalous. Until it is. Until someone needs leverage. Until someone loses power. Until someone stands in the assembly and hears their youth replayed like a transaction record. And then suddenly the gift was never a gift. It was evidence, which is why discretion became survival. And survival behaviors, repeated across generations, form culture. Ancient Greek cities were loud, markets shouted, assemblies argued, theatres roared, but private life could be surprisingly quiet. A citizen man married, yes. He had children, yes. He managed property, yes. But marriage was not designed for companionship in the way we imagine it now. It was alliance, stability, continuity. Wives often occupied interior domestic space. Public life was male. Symposia were male. Politics were male. Training grounds were male. War was male. And so, paradoxically, men lived constantly among other men, and yet could feel alone, because public interaction is not the same as intimacy. Public speech is performance. Public friendship is alliance. Public loyalty is strategic. But who hears you when you remove the performance? Who sees you when the lamps burn low? At first, the answer was simple. No one. That was expected. Stoicism was admired. Self-control praised. Emotion contained. Temporary restraint for the sake of virtue. But constant restraint leaves residue. Residue seeks release. And so companionship forms where proximity allows it. In the house, in the training field, in the court, in the hills of Crete. The pattern repeats not because society consciously designs it, but because humans seek closeness where it is available. And in Greek society, the most available closeness for men was often male, not necessarily by ideological choice, by structure. If women were socially distant and male company constant, the emotional gravity shifts. At first, perhaps it was simple conversation, shared jokes, shared exhaustion after debate, shared silence after war, temporary relief from public posture, but repeated relief becomes necessity. Necessity becomes expectation, and expectation quietly reshapes culture. A man who is accustomed to someone waiting for him at night, even just to remove sandals, may begin to depend on that presence emotionally. Dependence grows slowly, so slowly that it feels natural, not dramatic, not scandalous, just comfortable. Comfort is persuasive. Once comfort exists, losing it feels painful. So arrangements that began for labor or mentorship persist because they soothe something deeper. Loneliness rarely appears in speeches, but it hums beneath everything. Now here is the subtle irony. Greek philosophy elevated rational self-mastery. To be ruled by desire was shameful. To lack control was weakness. But needing companionship is not the same as lacking control. It is human. And because the culture did not provide many sanctioned outlets for emotional intimacy between adult men and women in public life, other forms filled the space, quietly, improvised, temporary, until not temporary anymore. And because it filled a real emotional need, dismantling it would have required replacing it, which is difficult. Societies are reluctant to remove something that works, even imperfectly, unless they have a better substitute. So the structure remains. Young men grow up seeing older men accompanied, seeing attachments that are never fully named, learning without explicit instruction that closeness can be found in certain directions, even if officially denied, even if publicly mocked, even if politically dangerous. It persists because it answers something basic, and basic needs are stubborn. Now imagine the adult citizen at the center of all this. He attends the assembly. He argues law. He returns home. His wife manages domestic space. His children are noisy. But emotional transparency is rare. He may feel affection, but not conversation. So he drifts towards someone who shares his daily public life. Someone who understands the same political rivalries, the same gymnasium culture, the same jokes, the same anxieties. Shared context accelerates intimacy. Temporary companionship during youth, extended companionship during adulthood. Gradually, a system that began as mentorship becomes something else. Less formal, more familiar, not always sexual, not always transactional, just close. And closeness, once normalized, blurs boundaries. What began as practical support becomes emotional reliance. What began as ritual becomes habit. What began as gift becomes expectation. And because each stage felt temporary at the time, no one felt responsible for building the structure. Yet there it stands, across centuries, across regions, household, symposium, court, training ground, the same quiet gravity, pulling men toward one another, not loudly, not uniformly, not without tension, but persistently, and that persistence is the key. Temporary solutions rarely endure unless they solve something real. And loneliness, in a society obsessed with public performance, is very real. So perhaps the system was less about indulgence and more about equilibrium, an unsanctioned balance, an emotional architecture built in the gaps of official life. No one planned it, no one drafted it, but everyone, in some way, adjusted to it, and adjustment, repeated long enough, becomes culture. The banners are different now. Roman standards hang where Greek symbols once did. Officials speak Latin in public decrees, but inside the houses, the courtyards are unchanged. Stone does not care who governs, and human arrangements are stubborn. Roman authority arrives with law, classification, new vocabulary, more explicit categories. The Romans liked naming things, labeling behaviors, cataloguing moral anxieties. But the Greek world did not dissolve overnight. It absorbed, adjusted, translated, and translation is subtle. A Greek word becomes a Roman one. An insult shifts shape. A gesture acquires new tone, but proximity remains proximity. Now imagine a Greek household under Roman oversight. The son we left behind is older. His son now grows up under a different political sky. He hears different speeches. He learns different legal risks. Rome has its own ideas about masculinity, its own obsession with dominance and submission, its own anxieties about who penetrates and who is penetrated. The moral language sharpens, the categories harden, but daily life still requires attendance, still requires companionship, still requires someone to walk a step behind. Temporary Roman reform, permanent Greek habit. And habits are resilient. If Roman elites mock Greek softness, Greek elites learn to reframe closeness as refinement, as philosophy, as aesthetic appreciation. Language adapts. Where once it was mentorship, now it may be described as cultured admiration. Where once it was ritual, now it becomes education. Temporary adjustment to foreign rule. Permanent rebranding. This is how systems survive conquest. They do not resist directly, they translate themselves. Now consider the insult that travels across time, a word implying effeminacy, a word implying moral weakness. It changes pronunciation, but the accusation remains similar. Men still weaponize past intimacy against rivals. Courts still entertain rumor. Only the rhetoric evolves. Roman governance may tighten certain laws, but enforcement depends on politics, and politics still relies on spectacle. So relationships continue, quieter perhaps, more coded, more carefully narrated, but not erased, because the structural causes remain: male public life, male military culture, male political networks, and the same human need for recognition. Temporary empire, permanent human pattern. Now imagine a Roman official visiting a Greek city. He observes a symposium, perhaps with discomfort, perhaps with fascination. He interprets what he sees through his own framework: dominance, hierarchy, control. The Greeks interpret their own behavior differently: camaraderie, culture, tradition, two lenses on the same arrangement. And because empires rarely micromanage private space consistently, the arrangement persists, shaped by new anxieties, but breathing through reinterpretation. This is the strange durability of social improvisation. It does not depend on one political system. It can inhabit democracy, monarchy, empire. It adapts to legal codes. It survives satire. It survives moral panic because it is embedded in everyday structure, in how houses are built, in how boys are raised, in how men socialize, in how loneliness is managed. Remove Rome, the house remains. Remove Athens, the courtyard remains. Remove the king, the corridors remain, and inside corridors, repetition is easy. Now here is a gentle irony. As Roman moral discourse grows louder, emphasizing proper masculinity, the actual lived experiences in Greek cities remain layered. Public virtue, private arrangement, public condemnation, private continuation. The tension does not vanish. It becomes background noise. And background noise can last centuries without anyone noticing how long it has been humming. Temporary adaptation, permanent survival. The grandson may speak Latin. He may quote Roman poets. He may publicly condemn certain behaviors to prove loyalty. And yet, inside the house, proximity continues. Because proximity solves problems that ideology does not. It solves fatigue. It solves fear. It solves isolation. It solves habit. And problems that are solved quietly are rarely abandoned. The language shifts. The law shifts. The empire shifts. The stones do not shift. And human closeness finds space between whatever flags are raised overhead. New words begin to circulate. Sin, purity, confession. The tone shifts. The laughter in the theatre grows quieter. The speeches become heavier. Where once intimacy could hide behind philosophy or ritual, now it encounters a different kind of scrutiny. Christianity does not invent anxiety about desire. It reorganizes it. What had been political risk becomes spiritual risk. What had been civic shame becomes moral failing. The structure tightens. Language sharpens. Temporary tolerance narrows. But here is the quiet detail. Houses are still houses. Men still live together in close quarters. Soldiers still share barracks. Monasteries even will soon gather men into enclosed communities. Temporary devotion, permanent cohabitation. History rarely erases human proximity. It reframes it. Under new moral codes, the old arrangements become harder to defend openly. They retreat further into silence. But silence does not equal absence. It equals adaptation. Perhaps the language grows harsher. Perhaps public rhetoric grows more condemnatory. But daily life remains textured, complicated, messy. A man still needs assistance, still needs companionship, still grows accustomed to presence. And habits formed over centuries do not evaporate because a bishop writes a sermon. They adjust. They become subtler, more internalized, more conflicted. Temporary moral fervor, permanent human tendency. Now imagine an older Greek man living in this new era. He remembers stories from his grandfather about symposia, about rituals in the hills, about court favorites. He may not repeat those stories openly, but memory lingers. Memory itself becomes quiet inheritance. And memory does something powerful. It softens edges. It blends categories. What once felt ordinary becomes half forbidden. What once felt dangerous becomes nostalgic. And in nostalgia, the past is rarely accurate. It is emotional, which means the pattern survives not only in behavior, but in imagination. Stories are told quietly, jokes whispered carefully, rituals reinterpreted as metaphor, temporary suppression, permanent undercurrent. The great irony is that moral tightening often intensifies internal struggle. When something is publicly condemned, it does not necessarily disappear. It becomes interior, and interior life can be just as persistent as public life once was, but slower, quieter, more hidden. The architecture of cities changes slowly. Churches rise, theatres decline, assemblies lose prominence. But the architecture of human closeness remains stubborn. Men working together, travelling together, studying together, praying together, and proximity always carries potential. It always did. It always will. Temporary labels shift. Permanent structures endure. Now, the house from the beginning, the courtyard with dust, may no longer stand. Stones reused, walls collapsed, but the pattern that lived inside it has already migrated elsewhere, into other cultures, other languages, other empires, because the story was never just about Greece. It was about improvisation, about solving loneliness, about managing status, about balancing desire and dignity, about navigating visibility and silence. And those are not uniquely Greek problems. They are human ones. So perhaps the most permanent element was not the arrangement itself, but the habit of pretending it was temporary, of calling it mentorship, or tradition, or discipline, or culture, or sin, depending on the century. Temporary explanation, permanent repetition. The lamps grow dim, the courtyard empties, voices fade into centuries, and what remains is not a single conclusion, not a clean answer, just the echo of footsteps in stone corridors, an attendant following a step behind, a youth being watched in a gymnasium, a general kissing a favorite before battle, a ritual in the hills, a joke in the theatre, a speech in the assembly, a sermon in a basilica, different eras, same proximity, same tension, same quiet insistence that this is only for now, only temporary, only circumstance, until time proves otherwise. If you're still here, the house is darker now. Not empty, just quieter. It's strange how 3 hours can pass and yet feel like a single evening. Stone walls, wine poured slowly, courts echoing with accusation, the wind in Crete, the cold discipline of Sparta, the glow of a royal tent, a Roman banner shifting in the breeze, a basilica replacing a theatre, and through all of it, a step behind another step, not always noticed, not always named, just present. That's often how permanence works. It doesn't arrive dramatically. It arrives through repetition, through comfort, through necessity, through pretending that this arrangement, whatever it is only temporary, only for now, only until something changes, and then nothing changes. And that may be the most human detail of all. If you've been listening in the dark, I hope the rhythm of it felt steady. If you're somewhere far from Greece, or very close to where those stones once stood, I imagine the night around you now. Maybe it's past midnight. Maybe the house around you is silent. Maybe you're the only one awake. Or maybe someone is a step behind you in the hallway and you don't even notice. If you feel like it, before you close your eyes, tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is there. I like imagining the map filling with quiet listeners. No obligation, just company. Let the lamp dim, let the courtyard settle, and let the footsteps fade into the background where they've always belonged. For now, only for now.